Rembrandt seems to be the oldest of old masters. It is strange to think that Caravaggio was already dead before he was born, and that Velázquez is his senior. Yet though he appears as old as time, he is every generation's soulmate. This timelessness is not an illusion. Rembrandt deliberately painted himself out of time, set himself free of the moment. Compare any of his self-portraits with a portrait by his contemporary, Franz Howell, and you will see two different ways of picturing time. Howells catches the moment with the flashing depths and spots so admired by the Impressionists. His sitters are in the here and now, leaning after the picture, turning and laughing, equally struck to see you. Rembrandt avoids spontaneity. His self-portraits are manifestly premeditated. They don't catch time so much as stop it altogether. He endures through the centuries. Rembrandt consciously removes himself from the present. The look of the self-portraits is partly drawn from an era before his own, from the portraits of Titian, Raphael, and Durer, and the clothes from the studio trunk aren't contemporary either. Some were made in the previous century. When Rembrandt dresses in furs, feathers, and velvets, he is in generic costume for the performance. On a rare occasion when he appears in contemporary dress, black and white with a ruff, the focus narrows and shifts, and he more resembles an unusually gloom sitter in Howell's studio. Our sense of Rembrandt as everyman or the great actor-painter is inflected somewhat by these antique clothes, but also by the genres peculiar to 17th century Holland in which he makes his appearance. The Chulnys, for instance, were character studios that appealed to collectors as types or classifications of humanity, though presumably as entertainment as well. The scholars most likely to sneer at anyone sensing self-awareness in Rembrandt are also those who contend that the self-portrait etchings would have been considered as nothing but tronies. Yet Rembrandt became recognizable through his self-portraits comparatively early and paintings that were both of and by him were evidently treasured. To be recognized for oneself, to be famous face in an age before cameras, is at the very least to be something bigger than a trony and considerably more than a type. Rembrandt's clothes also fit another pictorial fashion of the time, the popular portrait bistoury, in which contemporary sitters posed as historical figures. A young couple might be represented as Venus and Paris, for example, or Ulysses and Penelope. Rembrandt depicted his wife as Flora and himself as St. Paul. The sitters were meant to look like themselves, of course, real people but in historical costumes. The point was to be depicted in fanciful scene or metaphor, not buried beneath a disguise. Rembrandt went much further with this than any other artist in Golden Age Holland, infusing the portraits with such mystery that it isn't always possible to tell the actor from the role. Who, for example, are the two people in a Jewish bread, so tenderly adoring of one another, standing in undelineated space. Are they models for a Bible story? Do they represent the virtues of a marriage or the gift of a conception? Are they characters from a popular Dutch play concerning King Cyrus and a beautiful shepherdess named Aspasia, as has also been advanced? Or are they patrons sitting for a portrait history? One sees and remembers them as distinct individuals and profoundly observed, but that gesture of love, his hand gently placed on her breast, her tenderly covering it, seems to exceed portraiture, so that the picture becomes a kind of a secular altarpiece, an inspiration to patience, humility, and love. We do not know if Rembrandt knew these people, whether they were just models enacting the visions in his mind. It is in turn very hard to say at what point a Rembrandt self-portrait in costume turns from a role of performed to an individual portrayed. Always one knows this is a Rembrandt, the actor beneath the clothes, but the effect of these pictorial illusions remains elusive. John Berger once advanced a theory that Rembrandt painted himself without a mirror, or that he began with one and then covered it up, relying entirely upon his own self-knowledge. For Berger, this helped to explain both the depth and the extreme variations in the face, as Rembrandt turns inwards to paint the sense of himself in all its innumerable nuances, profound and unique. Sure enough, if there is a constant in Rembrandt's self-portrait, it is the impression of a soul-penetrating individuality that could never be reproduced. And yet it was, over and again during his lifetime, and often at Rembrandt's own behest. In a studio he maintained for over 20 years, students frequently copied his self-portraits and quite possibly forged them, as well as mimicking their style. Self-portraits exist by Govert Flinck and Ferdinand Bo, for instance, that have been painted to look precisely like the master. Until quite recently, the Flinck was even though to be a Rembrandt self-portrait, and the resemblance was deliberate. Flinck found it hard to make a name for himself when he left Rembrandt's studio, and Houbraken says that it was more profitable for him to imitate the handling of paint and the manner of the paintings of Rembrandt, since every aspect of Rembrandt's touch was praised at that time. Everything had to be cast in that mode if it was to please the world. Uniqueness is what one might reasonably expect from self-portraits. Uniqueness and authenticity. They should be deep and true, and irreproducible. These versions of Rembrandt that had convinced us for so long, and are painted with so much more than mere skill, something more like insight, in fact, perhaps deserve to be called Rembrandt self-portraits as well. He licensed their production, after all, had his assistants copy his signature, invented and propagated a self-portrait type into which other artists could fit themselves. Isn't this some kind of a cheat? Certainly. if one thinks of one's self as entirely out of bounds, an island, impenetrable, beyond the comprehension of other people, and of the self-portrait as therefore having the unique status of DNA or fingerprints. But paintings are fictions, and self-portraits too. There is not a novelist alive who does not believe it possible to enter the mind and the voice of someone else, real or imaginary, and the same is true of painters. There is a mid-period self-portrait of Rembrandt, for instance, by one of his pupils that has every aspect of the look right, even down to the disappointment and self-reliance. The execution is very nearly indistinguishable from a Rembrandt, but far more striking is the empathy. The artist understands or has learned from studying his art what it is like to be Rembrandt. If there is a Rembrandt self-portrait type, then that is its a commanding characteristic. This sense of an inner imagination, a gift for seeing from within, as well as without. You might say this is true of all of his portraits, and in that sense, the self-portraits are a variation within a strand. But compare one with the other, and there is still something else, something more, the very thing that distinguishes portraits from self-portraits. Rembrandt painted Jacob Trappe in 1661, the year of his death. Trappe was the richest of all Rembrandt's clients, arms dealer and merchant. The portrait shows a wizened but a hawkish potentate, enthroned with something like a scepter in one hand. The light is benign. The paint fluently laid and Trappe, whatever he has done in his life, receives the greatest respect, although his face is sunken and shrewd, and the skin of the hands so knotted with veins they appear as thick as gloves. He is not a spent force, not a shadow of his former self, but a figure of a terrific authority, authority partly endured by the pose and the clothing, the robes that give him a stature, but also by the rich massing of Rembrandt's paint. A prince among men, possibly a king, this is to some extent a very grand instance of the portrait history, which is exactly how you might also describe the magnificent self-portrait that hangs in the Frick collection of New York. Rembrandt with the same clothes and pose, the same scepter and authority that would be bestowed on Trappe some 3 years later. Here he is, presiding over the great hall of Frick among the Persian carpets and marble urns, and in one of the most extravagant frames ever made. Rembrandt finally at home, king of art. Here the great chief is kept in the style to which he was accustomed during the golden years in Amsterdam before bankruptcy. Lawsuits and social opprobrium brought him down. With those great hammer hands, golden tunic and sash, and the copious furs that take him out of time. This is surely the most regal, magisterial, dazzlingly self-possessed of all self-portraits, until you look into the deep shadow beneath the velvet hat and see those penetrating eyes, watchful, very impatient, perhaps even defensively skeptical, keeping up appearances against all kinds of turmoil and doubt. The face is fallen, the man prematurely old and scarred, but bearing up. It is not the kingly attire that gives dignity and power to this self-portrait, but Rembrandt's sacrifice of himself to his own merciless scrutiny, and this distance between performance and the performer is the source of the painting's tragic aura. Jacob Trape is powerfully intelligent, you feel, but single-minded and self-protecting. There's no reciprocal inquiry in his face, perhaps because this portrait is based on an earlier version, and the same is true of nearly all of Rembrandt's sitters, whereas the artist, looking at himself, is driven to search and explore. The depths of his self-portraits is not an illusion or an anachronism invented by the Romantics and reinforced ever since. It is real and a function of that pressing look of exploration quite apart from anything else. Unlike Rubens, his contemporary, whose solo self-portraits turn a supremely steady face to the world, the same face every time, Rembrandt sees nothing so simple or fixed before him. There are Rembrandt's self-portraits, for instance, that are very hard to love, and not just the pawky adenoidal youth or the cackling prodigal in the tavern, but some of the late self-portraits where he leans unpleasantly close to self-pity, sweeping and absurd in his heights, making an old curmudgeon of himself. Such paintings put one in mind of the affecting afterword in Gary Schultz's monumental biography. It would hurt me if the reader thought I was painting too black a picture of Rembrandt's character by leaving out evidence of his humanity. Believe me, this is not so. Having published every available contemporary document which intermittently show Rembrandt to be litigious, careless, vain, abusive, conniving, and even underhand, Schultz has struggled to find just one proof that he was anyone's loyal friend, anyone's godparent, anyone's beneficiary in a will, anything to show he was generous or popular. But that is not what one looks for in the self-portraits, especially not the late self-portraits with their troubled conscience, their disappointment, resilience, and doubt. You don't go to these paintings for a mellow account of old age, no matter how inspiring they are. Rembrandt is just as likely to be irritable, proud, and uningratiating as he always was, if occasionally more penitent and sorrowful than in the past. But he never grants himself of a full pardon. What's given instead is something more like a charitable compassion. He is a sinner, a miserable soul, full of a fault and resentment and lacking forgiveness, but at least the self-portraits knew and honestly show it. The quotation from Montaigne at the beginning of this chapter continues thus: "All contradictions may be found in me. Whoever studies himself really attentively finds in himself." Even in his judgment, this gyration and discord, I have nothing to say about myself absolutely, simply or socially, without confusion and without mixture, or in one word. There is a late self-portrait in which Rembrandt depicts himself, unusually, as a painter holding his palette, and yet he is dressed like a king. He, his presence overwhelming, commanding. The Kenwood self-portrait with the two circles looks like the last word on Rembrandt's The Master, holding court in the kingdom of his studio, and a summary of everything he could do, from the immense variation of accents in the ambiguous face to the lightly scratched mustache, cloudy hair, and the flashing white streaks for a cap. A flurry of angular marks, sketches in the palette and brushes. The fur is a jadder of scumbles, and the famous circle sweep like skate blades on the canvas behind him. These circles have made a Mona Lisa of the self-portrait for art historians. Fragments of maps, references to the legendary freehand circles of the great Atlas, the worlds that have yet to be created, but the man himself makes the enigma. The black eyes are withdrawn, sinking into a face as strong as the Ancient of Days, yet painted in soft and unresolved strokes. What is the expression? Stern yet sympathetic, undeceived but forgiving. And to whom is this mercy directed, mankind, or poor old Rembrandt? The familiar face is inconclusive, no more the final account than any of the others. In this sense, the self-portrait represents the pinnacle of its art, and its truth that neither Rembrandt nor any honest man can sum him up absolutely or in a brush stroke. That's the end of Rembrandt by Laura Cumming. The book's name is A Face to the World on Self-Portraits.